Gracious God, may the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you and you only, God, are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So did everybody get their All-Access Pass? If you didn't get one, I'm sure there's some still outside each door, and I'm sure an usher would be happy to bring you one. So if you don't have one and you want one, raise your hand. We'll make sure and get you one. The point I hope you take home with you about these is that the priesthood of all believers, this basic document or basic doctrinal understanding of much of the church, the priesthood of all believers is our all-access pass to everything God has to offer. On the other hand, am I the only one here who has ever prayed for a good parking space? Or not to have to wait very long at the doctor's for my appointment to come up? Or for a specific item to go on sale because I really, really want it, but not at full price? Or there's the opposite side of that prayer coin. Anybody ever prayed that somebody that just cut you off in traffic would get what's coming to them? Some of you might have prayed that today. Have you ever prayed for a specific sports team? You don't have to raise your hands. It's okay. Or maybe even that somebody would suffer some malady or misfortune because it seems like everything always goes their way. Well, if you've ever prayed any of those things, or anything like them, or even something worse, I have really good news for you. I think you're in good company. The Psalms overflow with these very kinds of obsessive prayers. Now know this, a healthy relationship means that you can share anything, you can say anything, and trust the other person to hear you, to really listen to you. And sometimes you're just blowing off steam. Sometimes just letting those horrid little thoughts gurgle out of your mouth is the only way to really get rid of them. Sometimes, thankfully, admitting out loud that you wish somebody else ill is all the revenge that your soul really needs to feel better. Well, a relationship with God is in many ways like a relationship that you would have with another person. You can say anything. Nothing that you can say to God or in God's presence will cause God to turn a deaf ear if you honestly name your feelings. Any real friend listens and tries to understand. So this morning we conclude our series on the priesthood of all believers. And we do so by considering, what do you want from Jesus? And I'm really tempted at this point to invite you to tell me what you want. What you really, really want. But this may not be the time or the place for that. But it seems reasonable to me that if we're the kind of people who would pray for a parking space or divine guidance on clothing selection, that we ought to consider, what do we really want from Jesus? I mean, we all know what blind Bartimaeus wanted. Bartimaeus didn't want a parking space. He didn't want something to go on sale. He wasn't out for the latest electronic gadget. He wasn't even craving to be free of some addiction. Bartimaeus wanted to see. And this morning's reading tells us about Bartimaeus. It says he's a blind beggar. In verses 47 and 48, it says that when he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was there, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, show me mercy." And many scolded him, telling him to be quiet. But he shouted even louder, "Son of David, show me mercy." So when Bartimaeus was blind, he wanted to see. That's all he wanted from Jesus. Actually, where it starts is what he wants from Jesus first, is he wants mercy. So calling out for mercy is how he got Jesus' attention. You and I believe that we don't have to call out for Jesus' attention. We believe in the tradition of John Wesley in this thing that we've come to call prevenient grace that we don't have to call out for God's attention. We believe that God is in fact trying to draw us towards God even before we're aware that there is a God, or that God might want us nearby, or that God loves us. So look at it this way. In this story, Jesus first walks close enough to Bartimaeus for Bartimaeus to call out. So in Jesus, especially in Jesus, we see God coming close enough to us, close enough to hear us, and close enough to respond to us. So we could all learn something from Bartimaeus calling out. His first words to Jesus are, "Jesus, Son of David, show me mercy." Which makes you wonder, who wouldn't want God to show them mercy? But on the other hand, who would take the time to ask God or Jesus to show them mercy? Well, those who feel like they aren't being shown mercy already. Those who feel like they're the perpetual losers in life's lottery. Those who don't live a life of privilege. This is why so many of us pay more attention to God when we're in trouble or down on our luck than when everything's going our way. So many of us are accustomed to the kind of life that only really needs, we've told ourselves, this thing that's called a God of the gaps. A God that we can summon whenever we need something so desperate as, a parking space. But a God who will leave us alone most of the time. John Wesley called this practical atheism. I think of it more in terms of functional atheism. It's the same thing. Many of us go about our lives as functional atheists. Here's a test for you. What difference would it make in your typical day-to-day life if there were no God, no Jesus, no good news of redemption and salvation and deliverance? So what do you want from Jesus? I contend that everybody wants something from Jesus, if only to be left alone. But we all want something from Jesus, and Jesus is walking through town today. So what do you want? What about your life would make you shout out to Jesus? Jesus, Son of David, show me mercy. Let's spend a minute on mercy here, because it always does us well to spend at least a minute on mercy. The word translated mercy comes from the Greek word that really means to feel sympathy for the misery of another. So Bartimaeus is inviting Jesus to feel sympathy for his misery. So immediately, I hope you caught this, immediately when he yells out, many scolded him, the text says. Another translation says, they sternly ordered him to be quiet. I mean, who wants to hang around with somebody that's always looking for sympathy for their misery? Well, apparently Jesus does. So why do we scold people who call out for help? Who are we to sternly order people to keep their misery to themselves? Because if we as priests scold those who call out to God for mercy, then we're going to find it really difficult to offer them help and hope that we believe can only be found and received from God. I think this scolding comes from our being people who have plenty of our own misery, honestly. Some of us have been carrying misery around for a long time. Some of us have gotten so good at carrying our misery around that we can pretend that we don't have any of our own, except that we end up taking it out on others. So here's a good rule of thumb. If somebody else's misery makes you more angry than sympathetic, it's quite possible you've got some misery to deal with. So Jesus comes near and this blind beggar shouts for mercy, and he's scolded. What kind of world do we live in where people are scolded for calling out to Jesus for mercy? We live in a world that needs mercy. This is just one of the stories in this section of Mark's Gospel that strike me with this thought. Was Bartimaeus the only one in that crowd that needed something from Jesus that day? It reminds me of the stories in Mark chapter 5, actually, that are echoed in Luke chapter 8. Stories where the crowd is so tight. In fact, the stories in Mark 5 and Luke 8 talk about the crowd being so tight, they're pressing in so tight on Jesus that all of a sudden he stops and says, somebody touched me, and his disciples let out a collective, duh. But the story goes on, and there's only 2 people in that tightly pressed crowd that have something that they need enough that they care to mention it to Jesus. Do you suppose there's only 2 people in the crowd that had a need they could bring to Jesus? Or that there's only 2 that bother? And this story about Bartimaeus, again, it mentions there's this crowd around Jesus. And yet, Bartimaeus is the only one that cares to bring his need up. So throughout the Gospels, you'll notice this. If someone brings a need to Jesus, Jesus hears them and Jesus helps them. In fact, it's not just Jesus. There's this long, rich history all throughout the Scriptures and the 2,000 years since that put in one sentence, God always hears the cry of the needy. Whether it's God's people suffering as slaves in Egypt, or God's people hauled off into exile, or a man with a sick daughter, or a Syrophoenician woman, or a woman who's had an issue with blood for 12 years, or whoever you are, God always hears the cry of the needy. So I suppose this is a good time to point out that for God to hear the cry of the needy have to cry out. So the obvious lesson that we learn from Bartimaeus is to be clear about what we need from Jesus. But maybe we need to be clear that we do in fact need something from Jesus. As we talked last Sunday, this priesthood of all believers, it really has 2 different sides to it. One is that we are all our own priests. We don't need some other person to stand to mediate between us and God. And that's one side of it. But the other side is that we are all also priests for one another and for other people. All of us who are following Jesus or are interested in following Jesus. And we're priests because we can get straight to God, but also for everyone else, because not everybody gets that they can have this direct, unmediated access to God. Some people, a lot of people, still think that God is this distant, angry, apathetic, busy on the other side of the planet being. Some people are convinced probably that they've already offended God too deeply or too often, and their chances are up. Even if you have on occasion prayed for parking spaces, God is still very much in love with you. And God still hears the cry of the needy. So we as priests are called to help other people know this. So you and I have this awesome ability to share this wonderful news with other people, that God does care about them. That they have not worn out their welcome with God. That God does indeed hear their cries. But it's really hard for us to convince other people that God hears them if we're the ones scolding them and telling them to be quiet. So I firmly believe this, and I firmly believe this because I found this to be true in my own life. The more we model crying out to God for mercy, the easier it is for others to believe that we follow a God who responds to people when they cry out to God for mercy. So I suppose we should tell the rest of the story about Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus wants mercy, but he wanted something more. Jesus heard him calling from a distance and said to his disciples, those around him in the crowd, call him forward. Now the ones that are scolding him do this immediate about face. And they said, be encouraged. Get up, he's calling you. Then, as Bartimaeus stands before Jesus, Jesus asks, what do you want me to do for you? So what do you want Jesus to do for you? After you've let go of your pride and your denial or your frustration or your jealousy or your rage or your bitterness or whatever has kept you from crying out for mercy, after you've gotten through all those who have scolded you or sternly ordered you to be quiet, and Jesus has called you to him, what do you want Jesus to do for you? But did you catch how the story ends? In response to Jesus' question, what do you want me to do for you? Of course, Bartimaeus says, teacher, I want to see. Now, Bartimaeus' focus is laser clear here. He knows exactly what he wants from Jesus, and he says it loud and clear. So, of course, Jesus heals him, right? I'm not sure that's what happens, because the text says that Jesus says, "Go, your faith has healed you." And at once he was able to see, and he began to follow Jesus on the way. When we are willing against the crowds to cry out for mercy, when we're willing to rise in response to Jesus' invitation, when we're willing to clearly articulate exactly what we want Jesus to do, I have a feeling that Jesus will tell us very much the same thing that he told Bartimaeus. Go, your faith has healed you. Then, like Bartimaeus, we follow. So what do you want from Jesus? What do you want Jesus to do? And then, will you follow? I mean, if all you want is a parking space, then I wonder if the God you're praying to is more of a concierge than a God. But that's only if that's all you want. No condemnation for anybody leaving this place and praying for a parking space. But if that's all your prayer life amounts to, what do you want from Jesus? What do you want Jesus to do for you? And will you follow? Please pray with me.